There is a man in the Bible who once held an argument with his own donkey and lost. That single image is the only thing most people remember about him, the talking donkey, the exasperated rider beating an animal that suddenly turns its head and asks him, in plain words, why he keeps hitting it. It is the kind of scene that gets drawn in children's picture books with bright colors and a sheepish little prophet sitting backward in the saddle. Harmless, faintly ridiculous, easy to forget. But here is the detail almost nobody emphasizes. That man was not a comic figure at all. He was a professional. He was a famous diviner from the lands near the great river, a seer whose name traveled across kingdoms, and a king sent for him with gold in his hands for one specific job. Not to bless, not to teach, to curse. To stand on a hilltop above an entire nation and speak words designed to break that nation, to wither it, to send it into ruin before it ever drew a sword. His name was Balaam, son of Beor, and he was something the tidy version never lets him be. He was a prophet, a mercenary, and a sorcerer braided into one body. A man who spoke with the God of Israel and also sold curses for a fee. A man who, when the curse would not come out of his mouth, found a quieter, colder, more devastating way to do the damage he had been paid for. Because here is the part that should make you lean in. The curses failed. Every one of them. God, in the story, reached into this man and turned his curses into blessings, one after another, until the king who hired him was shaking with rage. And you might think that is the end of it, a tidy victory. It is not. After the curses failed, Balaam did something far worse. He gave advice. And that advice killed more of Israel than any curse ever could have. So how does a man hired to curse end up doing more damage with a whisper of strategy than with all his sorcery? Hold on to that question. We are going to walk straight into it. And there is a second strangeness here worth noticing right away. This is a story about the most celebrated seer of his age, a man whose entire reputation rested on seeing what others could not see. And the most famous scene in his whole life is the one where a donkey sees an angel standing in the road with a drawn sword, and he, the great seer, sees nothing at all. The animal sees. The prophet is blind. Why would the tradition preserve, above everything else, the one moment that makes its sorcerer look like a fool? These are not accidents, they are clues, and the popular cartoon, The Cute Talking Donkey, has buried almost everything that made this man genuinely frightening to the people who first told his story. So let me do what this channel always does. Let me take you back, past the picture books, past the sermons, past even the New Testament, to the oldest layers of this story, to the actual words on the page in the book of Numbers, to a slab of inscribed plaster pulled out of the ground in Jordan in the 20th century, to the way an ancient curse was actually believed to work, as a weapon you could buy. We are going to find out who this man really was, and I promise you, the real Balaam is far stranger than the one with the talking donkey. Let us start where the story itself starts, in the book of Numbers, chapters 22 through 24. This is the primary source. Everything else, every later legend, every sermon, every painting, is built on top of these 3 chapters. So it is worth reading them slowly. The setting is the end of Israel's wilderness wandering. The generation that left Egypt has mostly died off. The people are camped on the plains of Moab, just across the Jordan from the Promised Land, a vast tent city stretched along the riverbanks. They have already defeated 2 kings on their way through. They are not a band of refugees anymore. They are a moving nation, and they are right on Moab's doorstep. And the king of Moab, a man named Balak, son of Zippor, is terrified. The text is honest about the emotion. Moab was in dread of the people, it says, because they were many. Balak looks out at this horde covering the face of the land, and he says a striking thing. This multitude will lick up everything around us as an ox licks up the grass of the field. He does not think his army can stop them. He has done the math, and the math says he loses. So Balak reaches for a different kind of weapon. He sends messengers, an embassy of elders from Moab and Midian, on a long journey northeast to a place called Pethor, near the river, the Euphrates, in Balaam's homeland. And the message they carry is precise. A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the earth. Come now, curse this people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out. And then Balak says the line that tells you exactly who Balaam was thought to be. I know that the one you bless is blessed, and the one you curse is cursed. That is a reputation. That is a man whose words were believed to carry real, operative force. Not poetry, not opinion, power. If you enjoy deep dives like this, where we peel a familiar story back to its oldest layer and find something stranger underneath, take a second and think about subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep making these. Now here is the strange thing that the introduction sets up, the thing that will haunt every interpreter for the next 2,000 years. Balaam is not an Israelite. He is a foreign seer from a foreign land, a man whose trade is divination, which the law of Israel elsewhere condemns. And yet, when the messengers arrive and Balaam tells them to wait the night, the God of Israel, named in the text by his own personal name, comes to Balaam and speaks with him directly. God talks to this pagan diviner. Balaam answers. They have a conversation. That should stop you. The God who, a few chapters later, will be furious with Israel for flirting with foreign gods, is here speaking in the night to a non-Israelite sorcerer as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Was Balaam a true prophet of the Lord who happened to live abroad? Or a pagan magician whom God simply used? The text, right from the start, refuses to make it simple. And that refusal is the seed of everything that follows. Before we go any further into the story, I want to take you out of the text entirely and into the dirt, because there is something almost unbelievable here. We have a piece of physical evidence found in the ground that names this man, Balaam, son of Beor. And it is not in the Bible. In the spring of 1967, a Dutch archaeological team was digging at a mound in the Jordan Valley called Tel Der Allah. It sits east of the Jordan River, in territory that in the ancient world would have been part of, or close to, the very region this story takes place in. And in the ruins of a building, they found fragments of plaster that had once been written on. Hundreds of pieces. The wall it was painted on had collapsed, probably in an earthquake, and shattered into a kind of jigsaw puzzle that took years to begin to reassemble. When scholars finally pieced enough of it together and read it, they found something extraordinary. The text was written in ink, in red and black, an old Aramaic or Canaanite dialect. Most scholars date it to around the 8th century before the Common Era, possibly the 9th. And the very first legible line, the heading of the whole composition, reads like a title. It names the words, or the account, of Balaam, son of Beor, a man who sees the gods. A seer, a visionary. Sit with that. The exact name from the Bible, the same patronymic, son of Beor, appears in an inscription on a wall in Jordan, written by people who were not Israelites, telling their own story about him. He is not a character invented by the authors of Numbers. He was a figure of regional legend, a famous seer remembered across cultures and across borders. And the content of the Dear Allah text is its own dark marvel. In it, Balaam receives a vision in the night. The gods come to him. And the vision is one of doom and cosmic disorder. The heavens are threatened, light is turned to darkness, and there is mourning. He wakes and weeps, and the people ask him why, and he tells them what the gods have decreed. It is a vision of judgment falling on the world. Now, this is not the same story as Numbers. He is not cursing Israel here. But notice what it confirms. Balaam, in the memory of the peoples east of the Jordan, was exactly the kind of figure the Bible describes. A seer who saw the gods at night, a man who received visions of doom and delivered them as oracles. The biblical writers did not have to explain to their audience who Balaam was, any more than we have to explain who Merlin is. He was already known. This is one of the most remarkable cross-references in all of biblical archaeology. A non-Israelite prophet, condemned in the Bible, turns up in his own pagan scripture, painted on a wall, in his own homeland's tradition. It tells us the story we are reading is interacting with something real, a shared regional figure that the Israelites adapted and the Moabites or Ammonites remembered in their own way. So this man existed in the cultural memory of the ancient Near East as a professional visionary. Which raises the practical question that the next part of our story turns on. If kings sent for men like this, paid them, and feared what they could do, what exactly did they think they were buying? What was a curse in that world supposed to actually do? To understand why a king would spend a fortune to bring a seer across the desert instead of simply mustering his army, you have to step into a way of thinking about words that feels alien to us now. In the modern world, words describe reality. In the ancient Near East, the right words, spoken by the right person, were believed to change reality. A word was not a label stuck on the world, it was a force released into it. A blessing was not a kind wish, it was a transfer of power and life that, once spoken, took on a life of its own and could not easily be recalled. And a curse was the dark mirror of that. A curse was a verbal weapon. Spoken correctly, by someone with the authority and the technique to do it, it was thought to actually reach out and bind, wither, sicken, and destroy its target. Words were ammunition, and a professional like Balaam was an armorer. We are not guessing about this, we have the artifacts. From Egypt, archaeologists have recovered what scholars call execration texts. These are objects, often clay pots or small clay figurines shaped like bound prisoners, inscribed with the names of Egypt's enemies. Foreign kings, hostile cities, rebellious tribes, sometimes even named individuals. The names were written onto the clay, and then, in a ritual, the objects were smashed, broken to pieces, and buried. The logic is chillingly direct. To break the name was to break the man. To shatter the pot inscribed with a city was to shatter the city. The physical act and the spoken curse worked together to do real harm at a distance. You wrote your enemy down, you named him, and then you destroyed the name to destroy the enemy. Thousands of years before anyone spoke of psychological warfare, this was ritual warfare, fought with clay and ink and breath. From Mesopotamia, we have a whole professional class built around this kind of power. Incantation priests, ritual experts, men who knew the formulas. There were elaborate ceremonies for both cursing and undoing curses, because if a curse was a real weapon, then you also needed specialists to defend against one. The formula had to be exact, the names had to be right, the gods had to be invoked in the proper order. A single error could send the whole thing wrong, even back onto the one who spoke it. This was technical work.
Dangerous work, skilled work, and that is the key to understanding Balaam's value. He was not just a holy man, he was a technician of unseen power, a specialist who knew how to aim the weapon of speech and pull the trigger so that it actually fired. Why did naming matter so much? Because to name a thing precisely was to get a grip on it, to lay hold of its essence so the curse had something to fasten to. The diviner first read the omens to learn the will of the gods, and only then, knowing the gods were on his side, would he dare to release the curse. Get that sequence wrong, and you were not cursing your enemy, you were exposing yourself. So when Balak, king of Moab, looks at the army of Israel and decides his best weapon is not a sword but a seer, he is not being superstitious in his own eyes. He is reaching for what he believes is the most powerful weapon available, a precision strike of cursing power delivered by the best contractor money can buy. He thinks he can defeat an entire nation with words, because in his world, words could do that. This is the trade he is buying. And Balaam, who has the toolkit, is the man to deliver it. So let us look at the toolkit itself, because the book of Numbers is unusually specific about how Balaam works. And the details are not decoration. They are a portrait of the technology of divination as it was actually practiced. Start with the money, because the story never lets you forget it. When the elders of Moab and Midian arrive, the text says they came with the fees for divination in their hand, the reward of the seer, carried in their fists. This is a paid transaction from the first sentence. And when Balak's first embassy fails to move Balaam, the king sends a second, more honored delegation with an extraordinary promise. I will reward you richly, and I will do whatever you say. Just come and curse this people. The price is being negotiated upward in real time. Balaam's reply, that even a house full of silver and gold could not make him go beyond the word of his God, is famous precisely because it sits in tension with how eager he keeps seeming to go. Now watch the ritual machinery once Balaam arrives in Moab. He does not simply open his mouth and curse, he builds an apparatus. He says to Balak, "Build me here 7 altars, and prepare for me here 7 bulls and 7 rams." 7 altars, 7 bulls, 7 rams. The number 7, the number of completeness and sacred order across the whole ancient Near East.
And then, astonishingly, he does this not once, but 3 separate times at 3 different locations. 21 altars in total across the episode, each set rebuilt from scratch, each with its sacrifices burning. This is sacrificial divination. The offerings are meant to secure the favor and attention of the deity and to open the channel through which the omen will come. And after each set of sacrifices, the text tells us what Balaam does next. He goes off, apart from the altars, to a bare height to seek omens. In one place, the text says plainly that he went, as at other times, to seek omens. As at other times. This is his routine. This is his professional method. He reads the signs. He watches for the omen. He practices what the Hebrew calls nahash. That word, nahash, is worth holding on to, and we will come back to it in detail later. For now, simply know that it means omen reading, divination, the seeking of signs, the very practice Israel's own law forbids. The Bible is telling you, in its technical vocabulary, that Balaam is doing exactly the kind of forbidden sorcery the law condemns, and doing it on a hilltop overlooking the camp of God's people. And the staging matters too. Balak deliberately takes Balaam to high places where he can look down on the Israelites, to the heights of Baal, to the top of Pisgah, to the top of Peor, looking out over the wilderness. The seer must see his target. The curse needs a line of sight, the same way the execration ritual needed the name. You set up your altars where you can look your enemy in the face, and from that height, you launch the weapon. Everything is in place. The fee has been paid. The altars are built. The bulls and rams are burning. The seer has gone off to read his omens and has come back to face the vast tent city of Israel spread out below him. The king stands beside his altar, waiting. The contract is about to be fulfilled. The most expensive curse in the region is loaded and aimed. And then, God does something no client ever bargained for, something that turns the entire transaction inside out. But before the curses, we have to deal with the donkey, because the famous scene comes first, on the road, before Balaam ever reaches Moab. And read closely, it is not a children's story at all. It is a deliberate, almost savage humiliation of the great seer, and it sets up everything that follows. Here is the setup, and it is genuinely strange. God tells Balaam he may go with the men of Moab, but he must speak only what God tells him. So Balaam saddles his donkey and goes. And then the text says something that has puzzled readers for thousands of years. God's anger was kindled because he went. God told him to go, and then burned with anger that he went. We will come back to that knot. For now, just feel the danger in it. The seer is on the road, and the God he serves is angry, and Balaam has no idea. The angel of the Lord takes up a position in the road with a drawn sword in his hand, an armed messenger blocking the way, ready to kill. And here is the heart of the scene. Balaam does not see him. The famous seer, the man whose entire reputation rests on seeing what others cannot, the man kings pay precisely because he perceives the unseen world, looks straight down the road and sees nothing. The donkey sees everything. The animal sees the angel with the sword and bolts off the road into a field. Balaam, blind to the danger, beats her to drive her back. They go on, and the angel stands again in a narrow place between two walls of a vineyard. The donkey, seeing the sword, presses against the wall to get past, and crushes Balaam's foot against the stone. He beats her again. A third time, the angel stands in a place so narrow there is no room to turn at all, and the donkey simply lies down under him, refusing to move. And now Balaam is furious, beating the animal with his staff. 3 times. The donkey turns aside 3 times, and 3 times the great seer, who cannot see what his beast plainly sees, responds with violence. And then the Lord opens the donkey's mouth, and she speaks. "What have I done to you, that you have struck me these 3 times?" And Balaam, in a detail that is quietly hilarious, argues back. He does not faint. He does not marvel that his donkey is talking. He is so consumed with rage that he simply answers the animal, complaining that she has made a fool of him and wishing he had a sword in his hand to kill her with. A sword. He wishes for a sword, while an angel stands directly in front of him holding one, invisible to him, ready to use it. The donkey saved his life 3 times, and he wants to kill her for it. Only then does God open Balaam's eyes, and he finally sees the angel and the sword, and falls on his face. And the angel says the line that detonates the whole scene. "The donkey saw me and turned aside 3 times. If she had not turned, I would have killed you and let her live." Think about what this story does to the most famous diviner in the region. It takes a man whose whole identity is sight, and it makes a pack animal the seeing one. The beast perceives the holy. The prophet perceives nothing. The creature everyone in that world would have considered the dumbest of animals outclasses the celebrated seer in the one skill he is paid for. This is not a cute interlude. It is a thesis statement, played as dark comedy. The man famed for seeing the unseen is the very last one to see the angel standing in his road. And that blindness, that comic, humiliating blindness, is a sign of exactly what is coming when he finally opens his mouth to curse. Now we arrive at the reversal, and it is one of the great set pieces in the Hebrew Bible. Balaam stands on the heights, the altars built, the sacrifices burning, the army of Israel spread out below him, the king of Moab at his elbow waiting for the weapon to fire. And Balaam opens his mouth to curse, and out comes a blessing. Not once, 4 times. The first oracle. Balak takes Balaam up to the heights of Baal, and Balaam looks out, and instead of a curse he says, "How can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced?" He looks at this people and calls them blessed, a nation dwelling apart, too numerous to count, and he ends with a line that drips with irony from a hired killer's lips. "Let me die the death of the upright, and let my end be like theirs." Balak is stunned. "What have you done to me? I brought you to curse my enemies, and behold, you have done nothing but bless them." And Balaam, almost helpless, answers, "Must I not take care to speak what the Lord puts in my mouth?" So Balak tries again. Maybe the problem is the angle. Maybe seeing the whole camp is too overwhelming. "Come to another place," he says, "where you can see only part of them, and curse them from there." New location, new 7 altars, new bulls and rams. And Balaam opens his mouth, and out comes the second oracle, even stronger than the first. "God is not a man, that he should lie. Has he said, and will he not do it? Behold, I received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot revoke it. There is no sorcery against Jacob, no divination against Israel." He says it outright. Your weapon does not work on these people. Balak is now somewhere between rage and panic. Do not curse them at all then, and do not bless them at all. Just stop. But he cannot stop himself either, and he drags Balaam to a third place, the top of Peor, overlooking the wasteland. And this time Balaam does not even go off to seek his omens. The text says he saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, so he simply turned his face toward the wilderness, and the Spirit of God came upon him. And the third oracle pours out, the most beautiful yet. "How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel, like valleys stretched out, like gardens beside a river. Blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you." That last line is the knife. The hired curser stands on the hill and pronounces a curse, yes, but it falls on whoever curses Israel. It falls back toward Balak. The weapon has not just misfired, it is turned around in the king's hand. Now Balak is done. He strikes his hands together in fury and tells Balaam to flee, to run home, no payment, nothing. "I said I would honor you richly, but the Lord has held you back from honor." And Balaam, before he goes, delivers a fourth and final oracle, unbidden, looking into the distant future. And it is the strangest and most consequential of all, because buried inside it is a single line that Jewish hope would chase for over 1,000 years. The entire transaction has collapsed. The fee, the altars, the sacrifices, the omens, the line of sight, the technique, all of it neutralized. God has reached into the most powerful curse mouth in the region and used it as an instrument of blessing. But that fourth oracle is about to open a door we will spend the next part walking through. And the story, far from over, is about to take its darkest turn. The fourth oracle contains the textual wow of this whole story, a handful of words that would echo across centuries and reshape an entire people's hope. Listen to them. "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." A star out of Jacob, a scepter, a ruler's staff, rising out of Israel. In its original setting, the oracle most likely points to a coming king, a triumphant ruler who will crush Moab and the surrounding enemies. Many scholars connect it, in its earliest meaning, to the rise of the Israelite monarchy, perhaps to David, the king who did in fact subdue Moab. A star and a scepter are royal images. This is a victory oracle about a king. But here is what happens to a line like that over time. As centuries pass and Israel suffers under one empire after another, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, the longing for a deliverer grows. And readers go back through their scriptures looking for promises of a coming anointed one, a Messiah. And this line, "A star shall come out of Jacob," becomes one of the great messianic texts. The star and the scepter are read no longer as David alone, but as the ultimate king, the one who is yet to come. We can watch this happen in the documents. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the community at Qumran quotes this very star prophecy and applies it to their expected messianic figures. The line had become a banner of hope. And then comes the most dramatic case of all. In the early 2nd century of the Common Era, around the year 132, a Jewish revolt erupts against Rome led by a charismatic military commander. His given name appears to have been Simon ben Kosiba, but his supporters gave him a different name, a title drawn straight from Balaam's oracle. They called him Bar Kokhba, son of the star out of Jacob, walking among them in the flesh. And it was not just the crowd. Rabbi Akiva, one of the towering sages of all of Rabbinic Judaism, is reported in the tradition to have looked at this rebel commander and declared that he was the King Messiah, citing the Star of Jacob. The revolt blazed for 3 years and was crushed with terrible slaughter by Rome. After the defeat, some bitterly punned his name into Bar Koziba, son of the lie. The star had fallen. But the point is unmistakable. The words of a pagan hired sorcerer had become so central to Jewish messianic hope that a would-be Messiah took his very title from them. And do not miss the layered irony here. The most luminous promise in the story, the star out of Jacob, a line carried as a banner by Jewish revolutionaries, and later, as we will see, by Christian readers reaching for the Star of Bethlehem, comes out of the mouth of an enemy, a foreign mercenary, hired to destroy Israel, blesses Israel against his will, and in doing so, furnishes one of the brightest hopes the people would ever carry. The instrument of the curse becomes the source of the promise. This is the deepest answer to why words mattered so much in that world. A curse could destroy, but a blessing, once it left the mouth, was a living thing that could not be revoked, and it could outlast empires. Balaam released a blessing he never intended, and it was still being chased 1,000 years later on the battlefields of a doomed revolt. So the episode in Numbers ends in apparent triumph. The curse failed, the blessing flowed, the enemy went home empty-handed. By every measure of that chapter, Israel won and Balaam lost. Which makes the next thing almost impossible to understand. Because if the story ends so well, why is Balaam remembered, across nearly every later tradition, not as a vessel of blessing, but as one of the great villains of the Bible? The answer is in the very next chapter, and it is the cold heart of this entire story. This is the climax, and it is the part the cartoon never shows. Numbers chapter 25 opens with a disaster, and at first Balaam's name is nowhere in it. The text simply says that while Israel was staying at a place called Shittim, the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. These women invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. Israel yoked itself to Baal of Peor, the local deity, and the anger of the Lord burned against them. A plague broke out among the people. By the time it was stopped, the text says 24,000 had died. Read in isolation, chapter 25 looks like a separate story. The people simply fell into temptation. Foreign women, foreign feasts, foreign gods, a plague as punishment. Balaam seems to have already gone home. But then comes chapter 31, and it drops the revelation that recolors everything. As Israel goes to war against Midian, Moses is furious that the soldiers have spared the women, and he says this, "Behold, these women, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor, so that the plague came among the congregation of the Lord." On Balaam's advice. There it is. The text reaches back and tells you who designed the trap. This is the sinister turn that the talking donkey buried. Balaam could not curse Israel. He learned, on those 3 hilltops, that there was no sorcery against Jacob, no divination against Israel, that God's protection over them was a wall he could not breach from the outside. So he found a way to make them breach it from the inside. The strategy, as the tradition reconstructs it, is devastatingly clever. You cannot curse a people whose God shields them. But what if you could get them to forfeit that shield themselves? What if you could lead them into the very thing that would turn their God against them? Send the women, open the feasts, mix the worship. Let Israel bow to Baal of Peor of its own free will. You do not need to curse them if you can persuade them to curse themselves. And it worked where the sorcery failed. Balaam stood on 3 mountains and could not bring a single word of harm out of his mouth. But this quiet piece of counsel, this strategy of seduction, killed 24,000 people. The most expensive curse in the region accomplished nothing. A whispered piece of advice accomplished a slaughter. This is the answer to the question we planted at the very beginning. How does a man hired to curse end up doing more damage than any curse? Like this. The curse was a frontal assault on a fortified wall, and it bounced off. So he stopped attacking the wall and went after the people inside it, offering them exactly what they wanted, letting their own desire do the work the curse could not. He did not break their defenses. He persuaded them to open the gate. There is a chilling logic to it that the ancient mind grasped perfectly. Direct supernatural attack against the protected can fail, but temptation, the slow seduction of a people away from their own loyalty, that needs no permission from heaven. It only needs human weakness, which is always in supply. He could not curse them, so he taught their enemy how to make them curse themselves. And that, far more than the talking donkey, is who Balaam was to the people who told his story. So how does the man himself end? The Bible does not let him retire quietly to Pethor with his reputation intact. It hunts him down. In that same chapter 31, in the war of vengeance against Midian, among the lists of the slain, one name appears. They also killed Balaam the son of Beor with the sword. After everything, after the donkey, the angel, the 4 oracles of blessing, the star out of Jacob, the council at Peor, the seer dies the same way an executioner of curses lives, by the sword. The very thing he wished for when he wanted to kill his donkey, the very thing the angel held in the road, is finally the thing that kills him. And notice where he is. He is found among the Midianites, in enemy territory, on the wrong side of the war he helped to start. He did not go home. He stayed to collect, and he died for it. The book of Joshua remembers him too, and the way it labels him is telling. In Joshua chapter 13, listing the conquered kings and peoples, it mentions Balaam son of Beor, and it calls him the soothsayer. Not the prophet, the soothsayer, the diviner, the practitioner of the forbidden arts. The memory that survives in Joshua is of a sorcerer killed in battle. But here is the fascinating thing. The Bible never fully resolves what it thinks of him, and that unresolved tension is the engine of everything that comes after. Because elsewhere, the Deuteronomistic tradition, the strand of scripture that runs through Deuteronomy and the historical books, remembers Balaam in a completely different key. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, and again when Joshua reviews Israel's history, and even in the prophet Micah, the memory is one of rescue. Balak hired Balaam to curse you, the texts say, but the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, and the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Read those passages, and Balaam is almost a backdrop to God's grace, the would-be weapon that God lovingly disarmed. There is no mention of his evil counsel there. He is the curse that became a blessing, and the focus is entirely on God's protective love. So the Bible itself hands down 2 Balaams. One is the vessel, the mouth God commandeered, the channel through which protection and the star of Jacob flowed. The other is the villain, the soothsayer, the architect of Peor, the man cut down with the sword among Israel's enemies. The same book holds both pictures and never tells you how to fit them together. Is he a tragic instrument or a wicked schemer? The text leaves the seam showing. And that seam, that open contradiction, is irresistible to later readers. Human beings hate an unresolved character. We want to know whether to admire or despise. We want the man sorted into hero or villain. And so the interpreters came, generation after generation, each one rushing to resolve the tension the Bible refused to resolve, each one pulling Balaam in their own direction. The contradiction the text leaves open is exactly what every later writer rushed to close. And watching them close it, watching how a strange and ambiguous seer gets hammered into a single clear shape, is where the rest of our story lives. The first great interpreter to take Balaam in hand is the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in Rome in the 1st century of the Common Era. In his enormous work, The Antiquities of the Jews, written for a Greek and Roman readership around the 90s, Josephus retells the whole biblical narrative, and he gives Balaam a full and vivid treatment. And what he does with him sets a template that lasts for 2,000 years. Josephus does something surprising at first. He talks Balaam up. He calls him the greatest prophet of his time, a man of genuine and renowned ability in divination, whose gifts were real and respected across nations. Josephus is not interested in dismissing him as a fraud, quite the opposite. The tragedy, for Josephus, is precisely that Balaam was the real thing, a man with true access to the divine, and that he ruined himself. How did he ruin himself? Greed. In Josephus, Balaam is a man torn between what he knows God wants and what the money tempts him toward. He knows he should refuse Balak. He keeps trying to do the right thing, and keeps being drawn back by the honors and rewards dangled in front of him. Josephus dramatizes the inner conflict: the seer who cannot quite let go of the payday, the prophet whose gift is genuine but whose heart is for sale. And then Josephus does something the book of Numbers only does in a single backward-glancing verse. He takes the bare statement that Israel fell at Peor on Balaam's advice, and he expands it into a full scene with speeches. In Josephus, after the curses fail, Balaam comes to Balak and openly lays out the plan. He explains that the Israelites cannot be destroyed by force or by curse because their God protects them, but that they can be undone if they can be led into sin. He counsels the king to send out the most beautiful young women of Midian and Moab, to let them entice the Israelite men, and only to yield to them on the condition that the men abandon their own God and worship the local gods. Josephus even writes out, in effect, the seduction script. Do you see what this accomplishes? It takes a man the Bible left ambiguous and gives him a clear, conscious, articulate strategy of corruption. In Josephus, there is no mystery about Balaam's character. He is a man who knew the good with full clarity, who had real prophetic insight, and who deliberately, knowingly, chose profit and devised the ruin of an innocent people to earn it. The tragedy is not ignorance, it is cold choice. This is the birth of a figure who will dominate the later tradition, the venal prophet, the man whose spiritual gifts are real but whose soul is corrupt, the prophet for profit. Josephus, writing for a sophisticated Greco-Roman audience that loved stories of great men destroyed by a single fatal flaw, gives them a Balaam who fits that mold perfectly, a towering talent undone by avarice. And once that template exists, once Balaam is fixed as the gifted man corrupted by money, the door is open for the next interpreter to push even harder. Because for Philo of Alexandria, writing in the same century, Balaam will not even be allowed to keep his greatness. Philo will take the contempt one step further and turn the seer into something close to a fool. Philo of Alexandria is one of the most fascinating thinkers of the ancient world, and he reads Balaam in a way completely unlike Josephus. Philo was a Jewish philosopher living in Alexandria in Egypt in the first half of the 1st century, in the great cosmopolitan city where Jewish scripture met Greek philosophy head-on. And Philo's whole method was allegory. He read the Hebrew scriptures as a vast, coded text in which every character, every place, every event secretly represented a truth about the soul, the mind, virtue, and vice. So when Philo comes to Balaam, he is not very interested in him as a historical mercenary. He is interested in what Balaam represents. And what Balaam represents for Philo is the empty mind, the vain reasoner, the sophist in the worst Greek sense of that word, a man clever with words and techniques who has no real wisdom or virtue underneath. Philo leans heavily on the meaning of the name itself. He reads Balaam as signifying something like a vain or foolish people, a hollow people. The seer becomes a symbol of emptiness, of a mind full of techniques and incantations and divinatory tricks, but utterly devoid of the genuine knowledge of God. For Philo, divination, all that omen reading and augury, is not real prophecy at all. It is the opposite of prophecy. True prophecy comes when the mind is silent and God speaks. Divination is the noise of a self-important mind trying to manipulate the divine for its own ends. Balaam is the patron of that noise, and Philo does something delightful with the donkey. Remember, in the scene on the road, the animal sees what the seer cannot. Philo seizes on this. To him, it is a perfect allegory. The irrational beast, the lowly donkey, perceives the divine reality, while the supposedly wise man, the great seer riding on top, is blind to it. Philo reads this as the soul being wiser than the proud reasoning mind that thinks it controls everything. The lower faculty sees God. The arrogant intellect, sitting on top and steering, sees nothing and beats the very thing that is trying to save it. It is a parable of the foolishness of human cleverness that imagines itself in charge. So between Josephus and Philo, you can watch two different ancient strategies for resolving the Bible's ambiguity. Josephus keeps Balaam great and makes him a tragedy of greed. Philo strips away the greatness entirely and makes him a symbol of intellectual and spiritual emptiness, a clever fool whose own donkey outshines him. In neither case is Balaam allowed to remain the genuinely ambiguous, unsettling figure the Book of Numbers preserved. The discomfort is being managed. The strange seer who talks with God and curses for money is being sorted into a clean moral category. But the harshest sorting of all is still to come. Because when the rabbis of the Talmud and the Midrash turn their attention to Balaam, they will not merely call him greedy or foolish. They will make him the dark twin of Moses himself, the archetype of the wicked Gentile, a man so vile that they will debate whether he has any place in the world to come at all. In the rabbinic tradition, Balaam becomes something close to the embodiment of evil itself, and the transformation is breathtaking in its thoroughness. The sages of the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Midrash did not invent a new Balaam out of nothing. They took the dark threads already in the text, the soothsayer of Joshua, the counselor of Peor, and they wove them into a portrait of total wickedness. The most striking statement comes in the Mishnah, in Tractate Sanhedrin, where the sages list those who have no share in the world to come. The list is short and severe, and Balaam is on it. Among the named individuals denied a place in the world to come, alongside a handful of Israel's worst kings, stands Balaam the wicked, a foreigner, singled out by name, condemned not just to death, but to exclusion from the age to come.
That is how seriously the tradition took him as a figure of evil. And then the rabbis do something structurally fascinating. They set Balaam up as the mirror image of Moses. There is a tradition that asks whether the nations of the world ever had a prophet equal to Moses, and the answer given is yes, they had Balaam. But the comparison is built precisely to contrast them. Moses, the prophet of Israel, used his gift in humility and for the people's good. Balaam, the prophet of the nations, had comparable gifts and used them for arrogance, lust, and destruction. Balaam becomes the anti-Moses, the proof that prophetic power without righteousness curdles into wickedness. The same gift, two opposite souls. The Midrash piles on the charges. Balaam is described as arrogant beyond measure, as consumed by lust, as the very wellspring of evil counsel. The episode with the donkey becomes evidence of his cruelty and his blindness. His eagerness to go to Balak, which the plain text already hints at, is amplified into greed and malice. Every ambiguity in Numbers is resolved in the darkest possible direction. And then there is the wordplay, because the rabbis love to find a man's character hidden in his name. They split Balaam into pieces. One famous reading takes the name as Balaam, meaning he who devoured the people, or he who swallowed up a people, reading his very name as a confession of what he tried to do, to consume and destroy Israel. Another reading plays on a sense of without a people, marking him as the outsider, the one who belongs to no people of God. The name becomes an indictment. To say Balaam is to say destroyer of the people. This is the hostile reading that hardened into stone. For centuries, in synagogue and study house, Balaam was simply the wicked one, Balaam Harasha, Balaam the evil. The ambiguous, fascinating seer of the Deir Allah inscription and the original oracles, the man who blessed against his will and uttered the Star of Jacob, was almost entirely buried under this monument of condemnation. The rabbis took the seam the Bible left open and welded it shut on the side of villainy. And here is the crucial thing for our story. When early Christianity emerged out of this same Jewish world, it inherited this already darkened Balaam. The interpreters of the New Testament did not meet the ambiguous figure of Numbers. They met the wicked Gentile prophet the tradition had already made.
And they would take that dark Balaam and give him a brand new and lasting job. By the time we reach the New Testament, Balaam is no longer really a character. He has become a label, a byword, a shorthand you can invoke in a single phrase to brand a whole category of dangerous people. And three different New Testament writers reach for him to do exactly that. The first is the letter of 2 Peter, in its 2nd chapter, attacking false teachers who have crept into the churches. The author is looking for the perfect ancient example of a religious figure who sells out, and he finds Balaam. These false teachers, he writes, have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. The wages of unrighteousness, the fee for wrongdoing. In one stroke, Balaam becomes the patron figure of every preacher who is in it for the money, every spiritual leader whose real God is profit. And 2 Peter even brings in the donkey in a wonderfully pointed way. He says Balaam was rebuked for his transgression by a dumb donkey, speaking with a human voice that restrained the madness of the prophet. The animal becomes the voice of sanity, rebuking the corrupt seer. The second witness is the little letter of Jude, written at almost the same time and closely related. Jude pronounces woe on certain corrupt men and piles up 3 biblical villains to define them. They went the way of Cain, he says, and abandoned themselves for profit to Balaam's error and perished in Korah's rebellion. Right there in the middle, between the first murderer and the great rebel, sits Balaam, and the thing that defines his error is the profit, for pay, for money. The mercenary motive has become the very essence of what the name means. And the third witness is the most specific of all. In the book of Revelation, chapter 2, the risen Christ dictates letters to the churches, and to the church in Pergamum, he says this: I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the people of Israel, so that they would eat food sacrificed to idols and commit sexual immorality. Look at what that is. That is Peor. That is the trap at Baal of Peor, made into a living warning for a Christian congregation. Whoever in Pergamum was telling believers it was fine to eat at pagan feasts and join the local sexual culture, Revelation brands them with one word. They hold the teaching of Balaam. They are running the exact same play, seducing God's people into compromise from the inside, the way the seer did at Peor. So across these 3 texts, Balaam is fixed permanently into the Christian imagination as 3 things at once: the prophet who works for money, the teacher who leads the faithful into idolatry and immorality, and the corrupt religious insider whose sin is not open hostility, but seductive compromise. The way of Balaam, the error of Balaam, the teaching of Balaam. 3 phrases that would echo through Christian preaching for 2,000 years, a ready-made brand for any leader who sold the faith out. And notice what has happened to the donkey. In 2 Peter it survives, but only as the dumb beast that rebuked the mad prophet, a footnote to his wickedness. The talking donkey, the only piece of the story most people will ever hear, has been reduced to a one-line illustration of how corrupt the man was. The cartoon survives. The menace has gone underground. But I do not want to leave you thinking the darkening of Balaam was the only path the tradition could have taken. Because there was always another reading available, a more generous and more troubling one, and it never entirely died. It just lost. Go back to the plain words of Numbers and read them without the later villainy in your head, and something stubborn stands out. Balaam, in those chapters, actually obeys God, repeatedly. He keeps telling Balak's messengers that he can only say what God puts in his mouth, and then he does exactly that, no matter how much it costs him. Balak offers him a fortune and the highest honors to curse Israel, and Balaam blesses them instead, 4 times, knowing full well it means he goes home with nothing. On the face of it, that is not the behavior of a greedy charlatan. That is a man who, when it came to the actual words, refused to betray God for money. There is a reading in which Balaam is something close to obedient against his own interest. And in early Christianity, some readers took the oracles themselves very seriously indeed, as genuine prophecy. After all, the words were beautiful and true, and one line in particular leapt out at them: "A star shall come out of Jacob." To Christian readers searching their scriptures for prophecies of Christ, that star was irresistible. Some of the church fathers connected Balaam's star of Jacob to the star of Bethlehem, the star that the wise men, the Magi, followed to the newborn Christ. And there was a poetic logic that some found beautiful here. The Magi were Eastern astrologers, men who read the stars, practitioners of the very arts Balaam practiced, coming from the very region Balaam came from. Some early writers even imagined the Magi as inheritors of Balaam's own prophecy, Eastern seers who had kept alive the memory of a star that would rise out of Jacob, and who finally saw it appear. Think about what an extraordinary thing that is. In this generous reading, a pagan diviner becomes, against his will, the first prophet of the coming Messiah, and his prophecy guides foreign astrologers to the manger centuries later. The enemy's mouth furnishes not just Israel's hope, but the gospel's opening scene. But this reading made people deeply uncomfortable, and you can understand why. It is unsettling for a pagan sorcerer to utter true prophecy. If Balaam's oracles were genuinely from God, then God spoke real truth through a foreign diviner who practiced forbidden arts, and that blurs a line the tradition badly wanted kept sharp. The whole point of condemning divination was that it was false and forbidden. A Balaam who genuinely prophesied the Messiah was a theological embarrassment. So the generous reading lost. Not because it had no textual basis, it had plenty, but because the dark reading was simpler and safer. It was cleaner to say the man was wicked, and that God merely forced true words through him as an act of power, than to grant that a pagan seer might have been a real, if flawed, vessel of revelation. The tradition chose the villain over the ambiguous prophet, because the villain raised fewer uncomfortable questions. And the very existence of these competing pictures, the obedient blesser, the prophet of the star, the messianic forerunner, sitting right alongside the greedy fraud and the wicked schemer, tells you something important. Balaam's memory was never stable. It was always being fought over. The man on the page was ambiguous enough to support almost any reading, and so almost every reading was tried. Now let us follow Balaam out of the texts and into the eyes of ordinary people across the centuries, into art and image and folk memory. Because here is where you can watch, almost in slow motion, the menace drain out of the story and the cartoon take over. Open a medieval illuminated manuscript and you will find Balaam, and almost always you will find him in the same scene. On the donkey, the angel before him with the sword,
The little animal balking in the road. Across centuries of manuscript illumination, in psalters and Bibles and books of hours, the one moment artists chose, again and again, was the donkey and the angel. Not the curse from the mountaintop, not the trap at Peor, not the 24,000 dead. The donkey. The single most visually charming, most narratively safe moment of the entire story, repeated until it became the image. And the great artists kept it going. Rembrandt, the Dutch master, painted Balaam and the donkey early in his career, in the 1620s. And there is the scene again, the seer with his arm raised to strike, the angel above, the donkey's mouth open in protest. One of the giants of European painting, and the moment he reaches for, is the talking animal. In Christian art, there is another role Balaam plays, and it is a striking one. In the medieval imagination, Balaam sometimes appears among the prophets who foretold Christ, precisely because of that Star of Jacob. He shows up in lists and cycles of the prophets, the unlikely pagan placed among the foretellers of the Messiah, and he is associated with the star that led the Magi. The villain of the rabbis becomes, in some Christian art, a witness to the Nativity, the instability of his memory made visible on church walls. In the Jewish world, the visual tradition went somewhere fascinating too. In the ancient synagogue mosaics of the land of Israel, in places like the famous floor at a site in the Galilee, the artists laid down zodiac wheels and biblical scenes in stone. And the oracles of blessing, the lovely tents of Jacob, the blessing of the tribes, echo through the way these communities decorated their worship. The words Balaam spoke against his will became part of the beauty of the synagogue, even as his name remained cursed in the study house. And in folklore, the strangeness multiplied. Various traditions spun out tales about Balaam's sorcery, about how he flew through the air by magic, about elaborate accounts of his death, about his role as an advisor to Pharaoh in some legends, woven backward into the Exodus story. He became a free-floating figure of dark magic, attached to whatever a storyteller needed a wicked sorcerer for. But step back from all of it and look at the net result, and it is this. The image survived, the menace was forgotten. The donkey, that one safe and charming scene, crowded out everything that made Balaam genuinely terrifying to the people who first told his story. The whole apparatus of curses for hire, the execration rituals, the 7 altars, the cold strategy at Peor that killed thousands, all of it receded into the background, while a talking animal in a country lane became the thing every child would remember. This is the final answer to the question we opened with.
The man whose worst damage came after his failed curses was slowly, century by century, painted over until only the comedy remained. Let me slow down now and dig into the actual words, because some of the most interesting things in this whole story are buried in the original Hebrew, and they are worth bringing to the surface. Start with what Balaam is called when the tradition wants to condemn him. The word that Joshua uses, the word translated soothsayer or diviner, comes from a root that gives us the term kosem, the practitioner of kesem, divination. And this matters enormously because of where else that word appears. In the law, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, there is a list of forbidden practices, the abominations Israel must not adopt from the nations. And right there in the list is the one who practices kesem, the diviner. So when Joshua calls Balaam the kosem, the soothsayer, it is not a neutral job description. It is placing him squarely under a specific prohibition of the law. The label is a verdict. Now bring in the word that names the heavenly figure on the road. In the Hebrew, the angel of the Lord is the Malak Yahweh. And here is the lovely layered thing. The word Malak simply means messenger. The same word is used for ordinary human messengers, the envoys a king sends. So the Malak Yahweh is, at root, the messenger of the Lord, and the figure carries a deliberate ambiguity that runs all through the Hebrew Bible, sometimes seeming to be a distinct being, sometimes almost merging with God himself speaking directly. The barrier in Balaam's road is the Lord's messenger, the same kind of word as the human messengers Balak keeps sending to Balaam. Messengers everywhere in this story, and the one that matters most is the one Balaam cannot see. Then there is the beautiful pairing at the center of the whole episode. The Hebrew word to bless is from the root barak. The word to curse in the key passages is arar. Balak hires Balaam to arar, to curse, and God forces him to barak, to bless. The entire drama is the collision of those two roots. And notice the irony hidden in a name. Balak, the king, sounds like it sits in the neighborhood of that root for cursing and devastation. The blesser and the would-be destroyer face each other on the mountain, and the blessing wins. There is also a haunting little phrase in the oracles themselves. Balaam describes himself as the man whose eye is opened, the one who hears the words of God, who falls down with his eyes uncovered. Falling down with eyes uncovered. After a whole episode in which the seer was blind, in which his donkey saw and he did not, he now claims to be the one who sees clearly, fallen prostrate before God with his eyes finally open. The language of sight and blindness runs through everything, and here it turns. The blind seer becomes, in the oracle, the seeing one. And now your new word for today, the one that unlocks the diviner's craft. The Hebrew is nahash. It means to read omens, to seek signs, to practice augury, the careful interpretation of the natural and supernatural world for messages. When the text says Balaam went to seek omens, that is nahash. And here is the philological wow. That same root, nahash, is also the ordinary Hebrew word for a serpent. The omen reader and the snake share a root, and scholars have long puzzled and delighted over the overlap. The whisper of the serpent coiled inside the very word for divination. To practice nahash is, at the level of sound, to do the work of the serpent. Whether or not the ancient speakers consciously felt that connection, it sits there in the language, a dark little resonance under the diviner's trade. So the words themselves carry the whole drama: the forbidden diviner, the unseen messenger, the curse turned to blessing, the blind man who claims open eyes, and the serpent humming inside the word for reading signs. And even his name, as we saw, became a weapon, split open by later readers into he who devoured the people. Now let us be honest about what scholars actually argue over, because this story is a battleground, and the debates are genuinely unresolved. The first thing careful readers notice is that the narrative seems to have seams in it. There are oddities that look like the joining of more than one source. Most famously, there is the strange knot we flagged earlier. God tells Balaam he may go with the men, and then, the moment he goes, God's anger blazes against him for going. That is a real contradiction on the surface of the text, and one common scholarly explanation is that the prose narrative and the donkey episode come from different hands or different traditions, stitched together, so that the seam shows as a contradiction. There are also the two embassies, the first delegation and then the second grander one, which some read as a deliberate escalation, and others read as a doublet, the same basic scene preserved in two versions and combined. The Book of Numbers, on this view, is a layered text, and Balaam's story carries the marks of that layering. Then there is the inscription. The Deir Allah plaster text we met early on comes roaring back here as a major piece of the puzzle, because it gives us something almost unique, an extra-biblical, independent witness to a Balaam tradition. It tells us that a figure named Balaam, son of Beor, was remembered as a seer of the gods in the cultures east of the Jordan, in his own right, in a story that is not the biblical story at all. This raises real questions. Did the biblical writers know a wider Balaam tradition and adapt a famous regional seer for their own purposes? Was there a body of Balaam lore floating around the ancient Near East from which both the Deir Allah text and the Book of Numbers drew? The inscription proves the figure was bigger than the Bible, and that reframes everything. There is also a lively debate about the relationship between the poetry and the prose. The oracles, the actual blessings with their archaic, dense, beautiful Hebrew, may be older than the prose narrative that frames them. Some scholars think the poems came first, ancient blessing oracles attributed to a famous seer, and that the story of Balak and the donkey and the embassies was built later as a setting for them. If that is right, then the Star of Jacob may be a very old piece of poetry, and the elaborate tale around it a later composition designed to explain it. And underneath all of this sits the biggest question of all, the one that haunts the whole tradition. Was Balaam originally a respected seer who only later got vilified? When you line up the evidence, the Deir Allah seer of the gods, the Deuteronomistic memory of the curse lovingly turned to blessing, the genuine and beautiful oracles, the obedience to God in the plain text, you can build a real case that the earliest Balaam was an honored figure, a non-Israelite who nonetheless served the true God, and that the villainy was layered on top over centuries, driven by discomfort and by the dark hint about Peor. This is the deep answer to why the New Testament could turn a blessing giver into a byword for evil. It was the endpoint of a long process of vilification, each layer darkening the one before, until the man who blessed became the man who corrupted. But we have to be honest, we do not know for certain. We do not know how the sources fit together, whether the poems predate the prose, exactly what the Deir Allah text meant to the people who painted it, or who the historical Balaam, if there was one, really was. The debates are live, the evidence is fragmentary, and good scholars disagree. What we can say is that when you strip away the layers, you do not find a simpler man. You find a stranger, more ambiguous one. So let us put all the faces side by side, because that is where the real revelation of this story lives. There is the Balaam of the plaster wall at Deir Allah, the seer of the gods, the man who saw visions of doom in the night and wept and told the people what the gods had decreed. A respected, frightening, regional figure, remembered by peoples who were not Israelites at all. There is the Balaam of the Book of Numbers, ambiguous to the core. The vessel whose mouth God commandeered, who blessed against his will and spoke the Star of Jacob, and who was also the soothsayer of Peor, cut down with the sword. The text holds both and refuses to choose. There is the Balaam of Josephus, the gifted prophet of his age, undone by greed, dramatized into a tragedy of avarice. There is the Balaam of Philo, the empty sophist, the vain mind, the clever fool whose own donkey was wiser than he was. There is the Balaam of the rabbis, the wicked one, the anti-Moses, denied a share in the world to come, his very name read as he who devoured the people. And there is the Balaam of the New Testament, no longer a man at all, but a brand. The way of Balaam, the error of Balaam, the teaching of Balaam, the patron of every preacher who sells the faith for money. Now look at how these connect, because this is the pattern this whole channel exists to show you. Each layer is answering the layer before it, not the source. The New Testament writers are not reading the ambiguous seer of Numbers fresh. They are inheriting the wicked Balaam the rabbinic world had already built. The rabbis are not starting from the obedient blesser. They are amplifying the dark hint about Peor and the soothsayer label. Philo is reacting to the figure of the diviner, Josephus to the figure of the hired curser. Layer answers layer, each one a little further from the strange man on the page, until what reaches the average person 2,000 years later is a cartoon and a curse word. And the cruelest irony of all is what survived. The curses for hire trade, the entire terrifying world of execration and binding that made Balaam matter, the 7 altars, the omen reading, the line-of-sight curse aimed at a nation, the cold genius of the trap at Peor that actually worked where the sorcery failed. All of that receded into the dark. And the talking donkey, the one safe and funny scene, floated to the top and became the whole story. The menace sank. The comedy survived. Why was every one of these readings possible? Because the man at the bottom was genuinely ambiguous. The Book of Numbers handed down a figure who would not resolve, a pagan who talked with God, a curser who blessed, a blesser who corrupted, a seer who was blind. And that original ambiguity was the raw material every later age reshaped into the Balaam it needed. A greedy prophet for a Greco-Roman moralist, a vain mind for an allegorist, a wicked Gentile for a community defining itself against the nations, a corrupt teacher for churches fighting compromise. This is the answer to the question we opened with, the man hired to curse who did more damage than any curse. He did it twice over. Once at Peor, with a whispered strategy that killed where his sorcery could not, and once across the centuries, as his memory was hammered into a weapon that later writers swung at every enemy they wanted to brand. The man at the bottom is stranger than any single legend built on top of him, which leaves us with the question this channel always comes back to. There is a difference between saying, "I heard this is true," and saying this is true. Those are two different claims, and the gap between them is where this whole story lives. You heard, probably, that Balaam was the man with the talking donkey. Maybe you heard he was a wicked sorcerer, the prophet who sold out, the byword for corruption. And every one of those things is something somebody said about him, a layer laid down by an interpreter with a purpose, in a particular century, answering the layer before. What the earliest sources actually give you is something far less settled. An ambiguous foreign seer, real enough to be carved into a wall in Jordan, who blessed where he was paid to curse, who spoke a star that revolutions and gospels would chase for 1,000 years, and who then found a darker road to the ruin he was hired for. Between the cartoon you inherited and the strange man at the bottom lie centuries of creative interpretation, each generation reshaping one ambiguous seer into the figure it needed. And honestly, the man at the bottom is more interesting than any of the tidy versions stacked on top of him. The talking donkey cartoon is charming, but it is the least of what this story holds. The real Balaam is a knot the Bible itself never untied, a vessel and a villain in the same breath, and that unresolved strangeness is worth far more than any neat verdict. Here is where I have to be honest with you, the way this channel always tries to be. Scholars genuinely disagree about almost all of this. They disagree about how the sources fit together, about whether the poems came before the prose, about what the Dear Allah text really meant, about whether the historical Balaam was an honored seer later blackened, or a villain from the start. We do not know for certain, and anyone who tells you we do is selling you a layer, not the source. And none of this is an argument against anyone's faith. Tracing how a story was told and retold does not dissolve the story. But it is genuinely worth knowing, because knowing the layers is the difference between inheriting a cartoon and meeting the real thing. So let me hand the question to you. After walking back through all of it, what do you think Balaam actually was? A true prophet who obeyed God against his own prophet? A greedy mercenary who got what he deserved? A sorcerer who found a darker weapon when the curse failed? Or, like the Book of Numbers seems to insist, somehow all three at once, an ambiguity the text never meant to resolve? Tell me in the comments which Balaam you see, and which layer surprised you most. I genuinely read them, and the best ones often shape the next deep dive. If this was the kind of journey you enjoy, stay with me. There are more familiar figures hiding stranger originals just beneath the surface, and we are going to keep digging them out, one layer at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until the next deep dive, take care of yourself and keep asking where the story really came from.